A couple of years ago, I used to attend a boarding school in Singapore. This was for the last 2 years of high school, or junior college as we called it. I'm a Catholic, and since none of my friends in the boarding school were practicing Catholics, I attended Sunday Mass on my own every week. If you've been to Singapore, you know it's one of the best countries to go around on your own. It's sometimes even more fun than going around with other people, so this wasn't something that bothered me too much. This Sunday in question came before a long week of submissions and tests, so I was already stressed to begin with. On top of that, I had also somehow managed to oversleep, so I had to splurge on a cab instead of taking the bus like I usually do. I only got a limited amount of money for the month, and I spent most of it on food, so by the time I walked into the church, I was upset and just looking for some peace. I guess the stress made me look frazzled and upset, which might have been what caught his attention. As I was late for the Mass, I had to stand at the back of the church with the other latecomers, as there were no seats left open for us. This man was standing a few feet to my right. He was wearing spectacles and an eternal frown. He was Chinese, like almost everyone else in the church. I noticed him scowling at me throughout the Mass, but I ignored him on purpose because I didn't want to get pissed unnecessarily. I was the only Indian in my boarding school, so I was used to receiving weird, I'm not racist, but comments from my peers and occasionally teachers. It didn't help that the area in which my school and this church were located was a pretty rich neighborhood, and I had never seen an obviously non-Chinese person in the church. So the too long don't read is I was used to being a stared at minority. I refused to pay this guy any attention. What happened next took place in a lull in the Mass during the distribution of communion. Many people tend to move out of the church after receiving communion, so a seat opened up near where I and the man were standing. I moved towards it a bit, and after making sure there were no elderly around me who would like the seat, I sat there. The man maneuvered himself so that he was now standing behind me. This was when I began feeling unsafe. Then he began talking. His words were not directed towards anyone in particular. He seemed to be there on his own. The silence in the church only served to amplify what he was saying. Basically a propos of nothing. This random guy began railing about how the Indians were destroying his beautiful country. He went on about how they were prostituting themselves in the streets, stinking up their schools and hospitals, and making Singapore into a jungle. How the government needs to throw all of them out. He said a bunch of other things too that I don't remember now. He also repeated a lot of the stuff, which is why it got stuck in my head. He must have said prostituting at least 5 times, and maybe even switched it out for whoring once or twice. It was obvious his words were meant for me. I turned around to look at him when he first began, with a kind of "are you fucking kidding me?" expression on my face. He was staring at me. His face was the stock image for hatred and rage. The people around him were shifting uncomfortably. I turned back around, shut my eyes, and willed him quiet. But he didn't shut up. At some point, I began quietly crying. I wanted so badly to move away and to run out of the church, but I was scared of causing a scene and making people notice me in a way I didn't want to be noticed. I cannot fully explain the absurdity of this situation. We were in a church, in some other section. The priest was still distributing communion to the congregation. The rest of the church sat in prayerful silence. And in the back, in this one corner, this random guy was spewing hateful racist comments directed at a 17-year-old, and nobody said a word to shut him up. When the priest returned to the altar and had us rise for the final blessing, I took that opportunity to get out of my pew and move away from the man. And to my horror, he followed me. The Mass had ended by then and people were moving towards the exit, as was I. He followed behind me, raised his voice, asked me where I was going, and called me a prostitute several times. That was when a lady in the vicinity said something like, "Don't say that, don't use those words." But when I looked at her thinking she would help me get away from this guy, she refused to meet my eyes and just moved away. We got out of the church. I couldn't see the guy anymore, so I ran blindly towards the exit and in the direction of the bus stop. I couldn't think straight, didn't know what I looked like, and had no clue what was happening. I got to the bus stop and decided to get onto the first bus that pulled up, even if it was going the wrong route. I thought I was safe and got my phone out of my purse. Then I turned around and, like a horror movie, he was there, walking towards me. The only other people at the bus stop was a woman and a kid. I didn't feel confident enough to approach them and ask for help, so finger shaking, I unlocked my phone and called my roommate. She answered the phone groggily. I had probably woken her up, and without waiting for her to say anything, I told her very loudly that a strange man had followed me from the church to the bus stop, and he had been verbally abusing me and I didn't feel safe. The man who had been advancing towards me all this time went and stood with the woman and the child, who had also heard me, and moved away from him. A bus pulled up. I got in, the doors closed, and we pulled away. In that moment, I was so overwhelmed by what had happened that I stood at the entrance of the bus next to the bus driver and just burst out crying. I don't remember what was going through my head. My heart was going crazy in my chest, and I must have been having the worst panic attack ever. The bus driver and everyone else in the bus was staring at me like I was crazy, probably. At the next stop, the driver asked me if I was okay, and when I couldn't respond, asked me where I needed to go. I gave him the name of my school. A passenger who had just gotten into the bus took me back out, explained to me which bus I would need to take, and asked someone who was waiting on the bus stop to make sure I caught the right bus. Somehow I got back to the boarding school. I had left my roommate on the call, and it had made her extremely worried. By the time I got back to my room, she notified our mentor and had placed a call to the church to ask if I was still there and if they could find me. They obviously didn't know anything. So I guess that's my story. I just want to clarify that besides this one experience, I never felt unsafe in Singapore, and I'm not in any way trying to say that other people from Singapore are racist towards Indians. This did shake me thoroughly though, and I couldn't bring myself to go back to the church for a very long time. I truly hope I'm never placed in a similar situation like that ever again. I was about 6 or 7 and was running errands with my mother. One errand was at our church, which doubled as a community center during the week. It was only supposed to take about 5 to 10 minutes, and I was tired, so my mother left me in the car in the parking lot. Immediately after my mom went inside, a car pulled into the parking lot, and despite the lot being nearly empty, the car parked really close, almost next to mine. A man got out, and instead of walking into the church, he looked right at me, and I was watching him from the window. He walked up to the car and stared into the window at me. I was a very shy child and had the stranger danger talk from my parents, my church, and McGruff the crime dog, so I had become nervous just seeing him walk my way, and when he cupped his hands around his eyes to look into the car at me, I became very frightened. I scooted over to the other side of the car and he just kept looking at me the whole time. I still remember that look. I knew no adult should show that much interest in a non-related child. He didn't even try to speak to me, he just stared at me. Now at this point, it could be said that maybe he's just a creep, but right after I moved to the other side of the car, he went and tried to open the car door. Now my mother isn't a fool and the car was locked and alarmed. So the moment he tugged on the door handle, the alarm started blaring, and I swear little old me kicked into fight or flight mode, and I unlocked my side of the car, jumped out, and ran screaming into the church. I didn't look back to see if he was following me. I just ran like the devil himself was after me. I ran right into that church and down the entrance hall, screeching like an extra in an Exorcist movie, and smacked right into my Sunday school teacher and proceeded to snotty cry all over her. Needless to say, the guy and his car were gone by the time we went out to look. A week later, they put up cameras in the parking lot. Thinking back on this over the years, I think it's possible that he saw us while we were running errands and followed us to the church. I don't remember there being any kind of police follow-up, but this was pre-9/11, so the fact that he didn't even come close to succeeding due to the locked door may have been reason enough for my mom to just let it drop. I'm just glad he didn't succeed in whatever he intended to do to me. Growing up, I was kind of sheltered and raised in a fairly religious household. Adults were the only people I could really talk to, so there weren't many friends to be had. Kids kind of avoid that one kid that reminds them of their parents, and I had the adultification thing on lock, so yeah, there were no friends. Going to church and my private Christian school was pretty much it. I was at church on nearly every Sunday and again on Wednesday for youth group without fail. My 15-year-old self would probably die of a heart attack if she could see the heathen I've become now. One night, my youth group let out a bit early, and since sitting through the extended Wednesday adult service didn't appeal to me, I walked around the building as I waited to go home. I was walking past the concierge desk when I saw a man sitting there going through a mountain of papers. He also had a ton of what appeared to be luggage, and at 7:45 on a Wednesday night, this was out of place. He saw me looking at him and struck up a conversation. We discussed my school, my dream career, how Christian I was, etc. His name was Kevin, and he claimed to be the host of an AM radio show in which he discussed the Bible and various Christian-y topics. It all seemed okay at first. I had a little bit of an alarm bell going off when I first started talking to him, but he hadn't been inappropriate and I dismissed it, even though the feeling never really left me the entire time I was standing there with him. It wasn't until we started talking about theology that things began to get weird. He talked about what he believed the woman's role in a Christian household should be, and that even unmarried Christian women should adhere to these standards. I can only imagine why he brought this up. We also somehow got into the subject of familiar spirits, and this is when the conversation absolutely went left. He said that when his family gathers at a deceased relative's house for their annual family reunion, a white dog always appears out of nowhere and hangs around them. Kevin believed that because this particular family member once owned a white dog and said she would come back as a white dog, that a familiar spirit attached to her knew this and took this form to make the family think it was the deceased family member making her presence known. He said that he and his family always looked forward to it. It was then that I realized that the conversation had gone on for so long that the other board youth group attendees had made their way around to this area. One girl who we'll call Rita joined the conversation. This was when Kevin finally made the transition to absolute creeper. He pulled out a pink book-like magazine that was targeted to teen Christian girls. Kevin couldn't have been a day under 40, so it was supremely weird that he had this girl's magazine just ready and waiting to show to a young girl. He went through several pages and asked Rita several questions as he showed her the magazine. Rita's mother suddenly appeared and was interested in the magazine as well. Kevin stopped asking questions and told her that she could buy it from various Christian bookstores for $20. I took this opportunity to leave, but not before Kevin suddenly reached for my hand, held it for way too long, and kissed it. I didn't know how to react, but it didn't sit well with me. It just made me feel disgusting and confused because at the time I was committed to saving myself for every manner of intimacy for my future husband. Even as I write this about that odd night, I can still feel the spit he left on my hand. Gross. I thought about Kevin and that experience over the years, albeit sporadically, and prior to it surfacing in my mind today, it had been almost 4 years since I thought about it. Everything about him screamed that he was unwell and a predator, and yet he was there in the church looking for potential victims to groom or attack at some point. Shudder. What a creep. About 8 years ago, I started going to community college, which meant I had long days in classes at random times. When I got home from school, I would always park my car in the church parking lot near my house. I lived in a small house behind my parents' house at the time. One day I noticed that there was a man sitting in this green SUV parked a few cars over from mine around 9 p.m. when I got home. I thought it was weird because no one parked there at night as it was in the middle of the suburbs, but I figured that it was likely a one-time thing and forgot about it. The next day I got home at around 2 p.m. and the car was in the exact same spot with the guy just sitting there doing nothing. I thought that it was weird that he was there again, but just went to my house and watched TV for a while. I then got a call from my friend down the road asking if I wanted to go on a drive, so I left to go pick her up. I noticed that the guy was still there, still in his car, and he was still there when I got back. This went on for a couple of weeks. He was there every day for all hours, morning, day, and night. He would be there until 4 a.m. some nights. I started to get really weirded out by this because there were probably about 50 or more spaces to park in, and he was always 3 spaces away from mine. He knew I parked there as I was the only car that parked there because there was a gate to my house in the fence across from my normal spot. It was very unnerving that he was always there. Finally, one day I came home and the guy wasn't there, so I decided to park in the same spot he was always in. It didn't seem special, there were no extra trees in the spot and it faced the fence. There were hills on the other side which were much prettier and more scenic to look at. Once I parked, I stayed there for a few minutes and called one of my friends. Finally, I noticed something horrifying. I could see into every window into my house. I didn't have curtains at the time and had a pretty stupid habit of walking around in my underwear. I mean, I had a huge fence and there was no way to see into my house from the street. I freaked out and realized that he had been watching me. I took my parents' Mastiff and made him stay with me at nights after that. I also stopped parking in the church parking lot unless it was during the day, and parked it in the lot even though I had to open a huge gate manually to get in and then close it for the dogs. I told my dad, but he thought I was crazy and paranoid, but my mom, she believed me. One day we got in her truck and drove behind the guy's car to get his license plate number. He got really angry with us, stormed out of his car and yelled at us. My mom basically said, "You're really creepy, you can see into my daughter's house and you're here all of the time, day and night." He said that he was cooling down before he went home after he went to the gym. It made no sense. We called the police and they went to his house. It turned out he was a married dude with kids and he told them he was listening to his tapes. I had actually snuck along the fence where he couldn't see me at one point and just listened to what he was doing as his windows were down. He was sitting in silence and there were no tapes and I never heard them. The police told him he would be in serious trouble if they found him parked there again and that he basically wasn't allowed back there. I know the police get a lot of shit sometimes, but they were great during this incident and they said they scared him. The next day he wasn't around and I thought it was over. It was also my friend's birthday, so I went out to dinner that night. I came home around 11 p.m. and there was another car parked in the same fucking spot. I was livid. I knew it was him, but a different car. I told my mom and then just stayed at my parents' house because I was pretty freaked out. My mom decided to drive her car through the parking lot to see if he was still there. Once she drove through, she saw that no one was in the car. She figured it was a coincidence and drove past, then turned the car around. Once she turned the car around, she saw a man get up from a crouched position and then speed out. Apparently, she thought to herself that this was a prime opportunity to follow him. He was going 70 miles per hour on a residential road and went through a few different streets trying to lose my mom. Finally, he went to the main road and there was a red light. My mom pulled up next to him and he pulled his sweatshirt over his face and covered himself with his arms so he couldn't see her. He may have thought it was my dad, who was huge and an ex-NFL player who was very intimidating looking. Once it turned green, he sped off again and after about 10 minutes finally lost my mom. She immediately called the police and they told her that it was very suspicious and that she should probably leave chases up to the police next time. After that, the man never came back and I got curtains. To this day, I still don't know what his intentions were. I had a huge-ass 170-pound Mastiff who was very friendly to most people but was very protective of me to everyone. I also had a brother who was a double state championship-winning hockey player and a huge dad, but the only one who intimidated him was my mom. So I was around 16 or 17 years old when this happened. I used to work in a grocery store in what most might consider a bad neighborhood. I always worked around 11 p.m. and had to cross a fairly busy street to get to the bus stop. The bus stop isn't the most well lit and the buses have been known to pass people because they couldn't see them sitting there. So I'm waiting for the bus to pull up when this white minivan pulls up in front of me. This driver rolls down his window and asks how old I am. I just look at him because why would I tell a random person my age? He begins telling me that I should get in the van to go to church with him. I can see another person sitting in the dark in the back of the van. I can't really see him, but I can tell he's looking at me. The driver then insists that I get in the van so he can save my soul. Right when he starts to open the door, I start easing back to run and the bus pulls up behind him, blowing its horn at him. He slams his palms on the steering wheel and speeds off as I'm running to jump on the bus. I tell the driver what happened and he drops me off right in front of my house and waits till I run inside. That was definitely a creepy experience I won't forget. This didn't happen to me, but my friend's mom, when my friend was like 8 or 9. So at my friend's church, there's usually a lot of people, mainly middle-class Americans, but there's homeless people there too who like to worship and whatever. There's this old homeless guy who goes there. He sits about 3 rows behind my friend and her mom and her dad at the church. So one day while they're in church, my friend is looking around the church because she is bored and she turns around to see this guy staring at her mom. He then looks at her and gives her the creepiest fucking smile ever. My friend gets scared and turns back around but can't help but turn around over and over, and this guy is still staring at her mom and then at her. Church ends and my friend says, "We need to go home now." And her mom and her dad are like, "Why?" And so when they get in the car, she tells them about the creepy guy staring at them. Her parents think nothing of it and that she's making stuff up. So the next day they go back to church and walk into the same road where they sit at every day. On the pew there's this piece of paper and my friend's mom picks it up and is like, "Someone probably left this here. I'll give it to the pastor." And she opens it to see what it is and if it has a name on it. She reads it to herself and gets so fucking pale and cold and drops the piece of paper down. My friend picks it up and reads it and it says, "Hello, Christina. You probably don't remember me, but I remember you." And she turns around to the homeless man who is just staring and smiling. My friend and her mom start freaking out and my friend points to the homeless man and her mom looks at him and he makes this creepy wave. How the fuck did this guy know her name? They never talked. Anyway, so my friend and her mom leave right away and go home and they don't go back to church for like 3 weeks and go to a different church instead. While they are going to this other church, they start seeing this homeless man walking around their neighborhood. They live in a remote part of town just with houses and some farms. No stores or anything, so it doesn't make sense that this guy was out there walking on their street. My friend's mom starts getting really worried and so she tells my friend she can't go outside without her. But my friend is 8 years old and she doesn't listen, so she goes and rides her bike around the neighborhood. While riding her bike, she sees the homeless guy just walking around and he spots her and makes a fucking beeline right towards her. She turns her bike around and starts running for her life. The homeless man starts screaming, "I want to speak with your mom. Let me talk to Christina." And she's just riding for her life. She makes it to her house before him, runs inside, and her mom is like, "Where the fuck were you?" And my friend is saying, "He's coming," over and over. Her mom looks out the window, sees the guy coming up their walkway, and she locks the door and calls the cops. The cops come and he tries to get away through some woods, but they arrest him and turns out he sexually assaulted like 3 women from the same church that my friend and her mom go to. He got arrested and I'm pretty sure he's still in jail now, but it's still really creepy. At the age of 10, I went to this church camp that is called Cherry Run. I didn't bring any friends with me, nor did I make any. It was a rather miserable and lonely week for me. In the middle of the week, on a Wednesday, I was sitting outside alone. We just finished the evening service and had about 2 hours to spare before curfew. I just sat there reading a book in the dim light, feeling lonely but trying not to care. It was about a half hour later when a young adult male approached me. He told me I looked so sad and asked if I wanted to get a snack from the snack bar near the dorms. I was thrilled, to say in the least, that someone was paying attention to me. I agreed and I never asked his name. He was very tall with a little chub to him. He had greasy brown hair and these icy blue eyes that I'll never forget. But anyway, I ended up getting a candy bar and a bit of jerky from the snack bar and he paid for it. We sat on a bench and chatted for a bit and I was content. I had an odd vibe about him, but I decided to pay it no attention because he was so friendly. He took me to play ping pong for a bit, which I was dreadful at. It was a little before curfew then when he said we should go on a walk. I didn't mind and I agreed, trailing beside him as he strayed from the gravel path that circles the middle of the camp. Eventually we ended up behind the girls' dorm in an unlit section of the camp. I thought nothing of it until he asked for a hug. Complying, I allowed him to wrap his arms around me and I was stiff but tried not to mind. After all, he was really friendly to me. Well, let's just say his hand strayed from my back and ended up in an unsuitable place. They dipped past my clothing and you can guess what happened from there. I was traumatized. He made me promise to keep it a secret because imagine how sad the other campers would be if they found out how you sinned. Devastated, I agreed. I felt so sick to my stomach that I couldn't sleep that night. In fact, at lights out, I was so scared that he would return for me in the dark that I hid out in the dorm bathrooms until morning. The next day, I avoided all meals and hid in various places at the camp. I didn't want to see him, and every time that I did, he would give me this unsettling smile. I'll never forget it. I started getting really bad pains in my stomach and side and would hide out in the nurse's room for hours on end. I kept his promise and never told a soul. Now I live with this terrible secret that I feel immense guilt of. It haunts me every day in dreams and flashbacks. It's been 8 years since that happened. I am a 47-year-old female. When I was about 11 years old, we lived in Oakville, Texas. My dad was the preacher of the Little Baptist Church right off I-37, and we lived in the parsonage just back behind the church. My dad was also a mechanic in the next town over and was gone during the day, Monday through Friday. I have an awesome dad, by the way, super funny and very protective. He is a kind and generous man too. I had an older sister who ignored me most of the time and didn't want to play, and the town was small with very few kids to play with, so I ended up playing Barbies or such alone. I felt very safe playing in and all around the church grounds. I usually ended up playing inside the church during the hottest part of the days in the summer because there was no air conditioning in our house. The church was usually locked, so I would get the key from the kitchen and go unlock the door and return the key later. One Monday midday, I went into the church and something seemed off. I played there often, so I knew the smells and where things go, etc. I noticed that the church hallway smelled different, kind of musty-like. I remember walking slowly around the church with a kind of weird feeling of being watched. I mostly played in the auditorium and set up my whole Barbie, Charlie's Angels, Donny Osmond world all over the pews. I usually cleaned up my messes every day and put all my toys in a satchel that I carried back and forth home. That day I set up as usual and kept hearing the building creak and the air conditioning go off and on, etc. But also kept feeling kind of weird and uncomfortable, and I would stand up and peer over the back pew and check out the room. All summer long I went into the church playing and kept noticing things were different and not in the right place or out of place. We did not have people going in or out of the church during the week. This is a small county church and custodial work was done by the preacher and his family, us. My job was to vacuum and empty garbage cans, so I started noticing weird stuff in the garbage. An old t-shirt, magazines, not good ones for a church environment, let alone an 11-year-old, if you get my drift. And the weirdest part, the words and drawings on paper. The drawings were strange, but the words and poetry were sad and dark. Every day, little things were off, but not enough to make me go tell my mom or even mention it to my dad in the evenings when he got home. One Saturday, my dad was home and told me to go over and get some paperwork out of his office. The pastor's study is just off the auditorium, so I walked in and stood by the back pew. There are windows in the auditorium there, and I could see really well even with the lights off, and I could tell that there was a hazy smoke settling all around the front area around the podium. I had not been around cigarette smoke much in my life up to that point, but I remember realizing that the smell I had been smelling all summer long was stale smoke. I turned to go into the study and realized the door was opened and feeling a sense of dread. I ran as fast as I could out the back of the church and into the house. My dad was sitting and drinking coffee and looking at me. I told him everything in one big lump and started crying. My dad immediately got up and took a shotgun over to the church and started checking things out. A homeless guy was living in a utility closet in the church all summer long and had been there the whole time I had been playing there alone every day. He had come through a window in a Sunday school room. My dad told me later the whole story, that the guy was in and out of jail for petty thievery and breaking and entering, but really was just a 27-year-old who needed a home and family and didn't have either. So my dad helped him get a job and a place to stay on a local ranch, and he ended up okay and coming to church some that next year. My dad made friends with him and the guy ended up apologizing to me personally for scaring me. I remember his face and the pain in his eyes when he apologized to me in person, and me really hoping he was gonna be okay. I mentioned it to my dad when I was older asking about him, and my dad said that he eventually got married and had a baby girl. Good lessons learned that summer. Listen to your gut when things feel off and wrong, and help out when you can. My dad helped out the creeper and his life was changed. Very good stuff to live by. I was a young and naive youth minister working at my first job at a church. I had made a pretty active program and we were attracting new kids every day. One day this single father and a little boy show up. Okay, normal story. The dad is a big guy, not fat, just overall big, but just creepy looking. He was missing some teeth, didn't show much, and it flagged my intuition. The little boy is a troublemaker. His first day there, he is already pushing other kids down. He's a bully that has some serious issues. The dad has a sob story that he just left his wife and she was abusive. The little boy starts to show up to youth events and so does his dad. One day I'm sitting in my office alone and I hear something in my copy room. I don't think anything of it because we keep our door locked and you have to have a key or be buzzed in to get inside. I assume someone with a key is in, maybe the other minister. After a few minutes I hear a kid's voice, so I step outside into the lobby area. There's the creepy dad and the boy. They're going through the cabinets in the office. I have no idea how they got in here, so I hold my cell phone and stay in the lobby with them. I say that I'm about to run some errands and I have to arm the office, so they have to leave. In reality, I was just going to take a trip around the building to get rid of them. It is an ethics policy to not be alone with the congregants in the building as a protection for not only the congregants but the ministerial staff as well. I was going to do anything to get them to leave. As we leave, they go out one door and I go out the other. I have my phone ready in my hand in the car and the creepy dad starts knocking on my car window. I had an older car without power windows at the time, so I reach over and roll down the window a little bit. He wants to know if I would babysit his kid someday. He said that he left his kid by himself last week and the kid peed all over his apartment, so he was looking for a babysitter that would be a good influence on him. I said that no, I couldn't do that. I had other obligations and had no room to fit that into my schedule. He sat trying to open my door for a few minutes, then trying to push the barely open window down, begging me to babysit before I said I really had to run an errand at that moment. He finally leaves me and I drive away. I knew he would be there for a while waiting for me to return, so I go get an iced tea and a snack at my favorite fast food joint. I drive back to the church and he is still there. I call one of the other people that I knew lived close by. He agreed to meet me at the church. By the time we got there, the creepy dad and kid were gone. The next week I hear them in the office again. I still have no idea how they were getting into the office or what they were looking for. This time he tells me that he DVR'd a special about Jesus and he wants to invite me over to talk about it and eat dinner. He said he would even buy wine. I told him no, that is not something I can do. He then invites the youth group to come over to his apartment and watch the Jesus movie. I suggested that we could watch the Jesus movie if it was at the church, but that's all. He got pretty agitated at this point. It was about this time that I started getting weird text messages. I would get text messages that said, "You look so pretty today," and "I like that blue shirt," almost every day. Mind you, I wasn't at the church every day. I started putting things together when one Sunday morning I was using my cell phone in the front of the church for a children's message when it started to ring. It was that number I had been getting text messages from. I hadn't ever responded to the number, so I just ignored it. He kept calling it and laughing in the back of the church. He later said that it was him who pranked me in the church, so I knew the texts were coming from him, and I knew he was watching me when I wasn't at the church. About a month later, the text messages were starting to get a little more perverse. I was getting text messages from my secret admirer and graphic details of our date he had planned in his head and was planning for us. I had mentioned the text messages to my male supervisor a few weeks before and he suggested that I respond that I'm not interested. My professor, on the other hand, said to completely ignore the messages, which I had been doing. Well, this pissed off creepy dad. The messages started getting aggressive like, "If you don't reply, you'll regret it." A few weeks later, I was at a summer camp with kids at this point, and a fellow female minister looked at me while I was crying about this and basically said that the guy was a perv and I needed to get rid of him. We had a co-minister who was a male call the guy and told him to stop or I would press charges. The creepy dad then went and complained about me to the church board, saying I was leading him on and I was the one sending him the perverted and graphic texts. He had imagined that I was flirting with him while at church when I talked to him and his kid, when in reality it was my job. It was at this point that the senior minister actually listened to me, read the messages that I had been forwarding to the senior minister from the creepy dad, and was shocked about what was going on. My supervisor didn't believe me at first, saying that sexual assault doesn't happen in church from a congregant to a minister. It was at this point, whenever I did something in the service like pray or preach, creepy dad would walk and stare at me from an outside window until my part was done, and then the creepy dad would return to the sanctuary. It was at this point that a congregation member who was friends with the lady minister above put things together, but that he wasn't just sending me messages but also to 5 other ladies in the church. As things turned out, he has been going around to various churches in the area preying on the single women in the congregation and using his kid as a bait to get sympathy so he could have sex with them. It turned into a huge fiasco because the church didn't want to ask him to leave because it was open to everyone. But we had a predator in the congregation that made many people feel uncomfortable. He ended up having to move because of his job, but I am still creeped out by him to this day. This happened when I was a kid living in La Mesa, California. I was 5 to 7 years old, I think. We belonged to a moderately large Protestant church with a cheerful congregation, and all of the families were tight-knit, but there were plenty of non-regulars who stopped by. I have always been a very willful person with a bit of an invincibility complex and a feverish curiosity. As a little girl, you could tell me not to go somewhere before finding that I was already there. I loved exploring and being alone, and this story is about the day when I realized that wasn't the best idea. It's hard to explain how stubborn I am in general, and my parents had noticed this and would always try to communicate concepts of danger and fear to me, but it just didn't make a lot of sense to me. If something was scary, then you should confront it and fight it. That was my motto, I guess, at 6 years old. I had run along cliffs and swum out farther than I was supposed to where riptides were known to happen, but this day was the first time in my life that I ever really felt a pang of real danger, or a tiny thrill of concern that something very bad is about to happen. When church would let out on Sundays, everyone would proceed to the courtyard or the offices or the kitchen to help, and no one remained in any part of the sanctuary after some minutes. Since I was stuck waiting for my parents to leave, I liked to wander around up in the balcony where the choir would sing and play with the organ or stained glass. Sometimes I would sneak around in the back trying to get out onto the roof or playing where the vestments were kept. There was a behind-the-scenes area separated by doors from the elevated front of the sanctuary, and I had just been poking around in there when I decided to leave and heard someone call to me. I turned around and saw this guy, maybe 20s to 30s. Stringy blonde hair, clothing kind of indicative of a disorganized mind. Not a homeless person, but casual and abused enough that even a younger me recognized this guy was a little different. He greeted me warmly as though we were good friends. I recognized that I had met him before in this very same room. He had introduced himself to me as people from the choir walked out around us to put their things away. He had seemed a bit flustered at the time and had mostly made small talk about things, and then I left. I didn't remember his name or anything about him really, but I greeted him and was polite. There was no one else back here. The door on the other side was locked. I knew, so I wondered how he had gotten behind me without me noticing. I had gone all the way around when I first came in, didn't I? And there hadn't been anyone there. It didn't make a lot of sense to me. He asked me if everything was okay, and I said yes, thanks, but I had to go. And then he said, "Wait a minute, don't you want to hear how I'm doing?" And I told him yes, but that my parents were waiting for me. The guy proceeded to say he was fine and then asked me for a hug, already coming in for one. I said okay because it was clearly going to happen anyway, and I didn't want him to realize how opposed to the idea of being near him I was. Now I wish that someone was there, anyone else, but especially another adult. I started to think about how unlikely it was that anyone would ever come in here, how far away everyone was, how even the sanctuary had good acoustics and the front wasn't all that far away. No one would hear me if I yelled. He hung on to me in the hug for a very, very long time. Now I knew that something was definitely wrong about this. I said, "Okay, well sorry, but I have to go." And I felt him begin to let go, but then pause. I had goosebumps and not the good kind. I stepped back and he finally let go, but the look in his eyes was different, as though he knew what I was thinking and feeling and that I was lying to him and didn't want to be there anymore. His eyes were kind of slitted as he looked down at me. He was obviously considering. I smiled, trying to be as convincing as I could, hoping to make him believe that I was having a good time and that he should probably keep playing his previous game. After a moment of silence, I said, "Nice to see you. Hopefully I'll see you next week when we're not leaving. Bye." Smiled big, looked him directly in the eyes as I did so, and then turned around to ascend the few steps it took to get out the door and into the sanctuary. I could feel him watching me, still considering. Trying not to run, those few seconds slowed down in my mind and were some of the slowest of my life, I think. Every instant I thought he was going to grab me and pull me back down into the room. When I hit the sanctuary, after a few steps, I skipped fast for the rest of the way and finally hit the doors, back out into the sound of all the people talking in the bright sunlight.